good to go.
Okay. Should we start? Okay. So hi, everybody. Thanks for coming tonight. We're at Bloc Project live streaming. And I'm Sunshine. I'm the curator here at the gallery. And we're sitting outside having this conversation, which is quite nice. The weather has been good enough for us to do that. So we have Bahar Noorizadeh and Zhexi Zhang with us in conversation tonight. So what we're going to do quickly is I'm going to give a little bit of context about the project that Gary, Bloc Projects and Arts Catalyst, and Anna Santamaro, she is the curator at Arts Catalyst. Give a little context about the project FUD that we've been working on together, and also talk a little bit about Gary's show, Cycle 25, that's at Bloc currently. And then I'll hand it over to Anna, who will introduce Bahar and Gary. So yeah, we've been working on this project FUD for a year and a half, almost 2 years. And FUD looks into the risk universe. And this comprises speculations, predictions. I'm looking straight in the camera, maybe we should look at the audience, as well as belief systems. And not just to kind of think about future projections, but to think about how these stories and these narratives have very material and calculable financial impacts on the present. And in the show, Cycle 25, we're looking at two specific stories in this risk universe. One explores the sun and its relation to world revolutions, specifically how sunspot activities seem to rise around the time of world events. And the other involves a scam in the early 19th century and involves this made-believe country called Poitiers that was put onto the London Stock Exchange in 1825. Was that right, Gary? And somehow managed to accrue millions of pounds in investments. And these would-be colonists then traveled to this Poitiers and found absolutely nothing of this paradise that they were promised, and quite likely perished. So that is kind of the background of FUD as well as Cycle 25. So I'll hand it over to Anna, who will then introduce Bahar and Gary's work a little bit and frame the conversation tonight.
Thanks, Sunshine. Well, thanks again, everyone, for joining us tonight. As Sunshine mentioned, it is going to be a quite informal and fluid conversation between Gary and Bahar. So after they will give a brief introduction about the respective practices, we will open up to the question. There will be a few questions that I'm sure they would want to ask to each other, given the various tangential points of the respective practices, but we are also very happy to take questions from the audience. Just a couple of words about Bahar and Gary. I'm going to read the bio, actually, because they are up to so much that I can't really keep everything in mind. So Bahar Noorizadeh is a filmmaker, she's a writer and a platform designer. Her current research examines the notion of wheeled economies to precipitate a transdisciplinary approach to economic futurism and post-financialization imaginaries. Her work has appeared in the Tate Modern Artist Cinema Program, Transmediale Festival, Berlinale Forum Expanded, and the Geneva Biennale of Moving Images. She's a PhD candidate in art at Goldsmiths, at the University of London, where she holds an SSHRC Doctoral Fellowship. Zhexi Zhang is an artist and a writer interested in concepts that interface between concrete and abstract worlds, such as ecology, finance, and information. He's taken part in various group exhibitions, including Participation Mystique at the Ming Contemporary Art Museum in Shanghai, the Swamp School at Venice Architecture Biennial, Crossfeed at Glasgow International 2018, and he's been part of the Vidrome.org program. Gary is also a transformations of the human researcher at the Berlin Institute, where he studies non-human networks and markets. So I think at this point I will leave it to you guys, and yeah, hopefully we will have a conversation afterwards. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, guys. Yeah, and thanks to Anna for putting us in touch. I guess
Yes.
I remember we first talked online, like probably just about a year ago, exactly, probably. And I'm talking for like 3 or 4 hours or something. I guess I can give a little bit of intro to the show itself. The show here, for those who've seen it, is a bit of a symptom of like a longer arc of research, which seems to be kind of not really ending yet, which started with trying to kind of talk to various people who are in the practice of prediction and speculation. So it opened up with conversations with people working in finance and risk managers, especially. I was kind of very interested in how speculation is such a big term used, in fiction, in the art world, and kind of used all over these days, but also how people were kind of very, in a relatively concrete day-to-day practice kind of way, working with speculative frameworks, which also involved playing with risk and understanding how these risks were actually manipulated and so on. So I was talking to people in the city. I was in London at that time, and also I wound up talking to some people in like financial regulation and in catastrophe modeling, which is basically the insurance industry that surrounds global catastrophes, a hurricane in Florida, an earthquake and fire in the US, like we see at the moment. And they're the ones who underwrite the insurers. So you've got insurers and you've got reinsurers. And all of these people ultimately, at the end of the day, need a number from somewhere that supposedly comes from some kind of science, which they use as their liability, say, this is how we came up with this value. If you make this loss, it's not up to us. We got the numbers right. And so there's an infrastructure over the back of all of this, basically modeling and simulating the version of the near future that is used to price these events. And I got really interested in that because of performativity, because of this idea that models can, self-fulfilling prophecies, basically, the idea that models can create or transform the system that they're attempting to model. And also the question of how a system models itself, including art. So that's kind of where it started. And part of that led down this path of looking at the history of catastrophes, especially ones that have involved in historical transformations, which appear a bit in this show, which we can talk about. But and also later, in a few months after that initial encounter, I was in New York and got to know this financial astrologer who was like an older guy who has been working as an astrologer and then on Wall Street since like the late 80s, and became quite fascinated with his framework because there's an element of ambiguous science in all of these things, especially finance, obviously to some degree with astrology, but there's also an element of a system of rigor that is being applied to a fundamentally uncertain and very difficult to kind of anyone's guess kind of situation. That's the market is uncertain. That's why there's a market. And so I started making a film with him. It got crashed by the pandemic. Came back to the UK. And in the process of putting this show together, it became actually much more, maybe because of the pandemic, it became much more about historical research and looking at economic history and where particular moments of the concept of the economy started, and also where the value was determined to come from. So as Sunshine kind of mentioned in the beginning, this show primarily revolves around two stories or two kind of narratives that are a little bit entwined with each other. One has to do with this fictional country in the early 19th century, which is interesting because it's fictional, but also interesting because of the way in which all countries are to some extent fictional. And the person who scammed his way into making this country was also involved in fighting alongside the Spanish, the revolutionaries against Spanish imperialism in the colonies at that time, and therefore was also kind of involved in the founding of several now very much real countries like Bolivia and Venezuela, alongside like Bolivar and Paez and the like. So it's not so much like someone invented a country as like this was like a period of contestation around the idea of sovereignty and the state, where all these like things that are very much concrete now looking back were actually just up for grabs. And it was very much a kind of Wild West kind of situation there. And so this period, this guy Gregor MacGregor was, through a period of realpolitik, kind of given custody of some land by an indigenous king who was also kind of trained by the British. And he decided to do this land, which didn't have much on it, in Honduras now. He decided to take it to the London Stock Exchange, float it in stocks and shares, as well as in land grants, and sold much of it off to, it was around the time of the 1825 panic, one of the first financial crashes of the modern period. And so there was a lot of speculation in the air already. And so he sold all these stocks and land and shares, and the people were promised to become like the civil service directors and the opera directors and whatever of this new society, which apparently was full of gold and ore and trees and beautiful resources. It was like it was a kind of wonderful peak colonial wet dream kind of setup. And people bought into it, and he also went to extraordinary lengths of minting a currency that looks very convincing for this country, Poye, stamped by himself, the Cazique or Prince of Poye, and also publishing a guidebook allegedly written by a Scotsman called Thomas Strangeways, which is very extensive in documenting all of the trees and the plants and the edible, a document of all different animals and how delicious they are, all the different types of ore, where all the geological features are, and how to set up your first cotton plantation using a mixture of indigenous and slave labor. So it's kind of this bizarre mixture of catalog, brochure, and like kind of colonial handbook, WikiHow. And a bunch of people went there and died because there was nothing there. Like they voyaged in like 1823 and 1824, took the money, the Poesian money that they had traded pounds for, went over there and died. So there are three pieces of work which are kind of surrounding this story, which I guess I really like, because it has that kind of quality of sitting between, this has one foot in it's parafictional. It has one foot in the fictional and one foot in something that really operates. That fiction really weaves itself into the real world and transforms the world that it's kind of playing in. I don't going to spend so long on the one because I feel like I'm taking a lot of time, but the other work is, I also quite enjoyed making, because it was an encounter with this wonderful economist called Mikhail Gorbachev, who works at a very large DC-based economic institution, doing economic analyses of different nations and debts and projections and the usual kind of big national economy stuff. But in his spare time, he, along with a great tradition of quite weird economic thinking, is really interested in this idea that the changes in electromagnetic radiation on the sun, creating these sunspots, are in some way affecting the economy. And this kind of goes back to the element of ambiguous voodoo science that is economics, because there is a kind of cyclical pattern, no doubt, since records began in a way, of the moods of the market, how they seem to go up and down and follow roughly, like in the 19th century, they were obsessed with why they were 12-year trends and this kind of thing. And suddenly they realized that the sunspots also followed 11 to 16-year trends and decided that must be the link. But then some very esteemed economists of the time, when economy as a field was really only just being invented, like going from political economy into like something more mathematical and statistical. So there was William Jevons, who's a renowned late 19th century guy, British guy, and then another Russian cosmist scientist called Zhexi. And both of them were very respected in their research and in their other ways, but also spent a great deal of research trying to work out why the sun was affecting either the cycles of economic crises or the mass movement of human beings through revolution and mass movements of people. And so something that Mikhail did was say, well, I'm an economist. I can't just read this interesting stuff. I have to go and look at the stats and then compare them. And I went and did that. And when I did that, I said, wow, they're still true. Like even after these guys died, they're still following like more than a 55% kind of correlation. And therefore, I cannot ignore that. I can't like demonstrate it. I can't prove it, but I can't ignore it. And that's also at the heart of a lot of interesting quantitative financial thinking. It's just like it's about finding the kind of hidden correlations without necessarily being able to create a kind of causal explanation for why the things are correlated. So it kind of goes into that logic. So I get kind of fascinated with this as a story, but also as a way of thinking about time, like thinking about natural history and human history through the history of the sun and the kind of activity there. And so one of the works which kind of dominates the space, which is across all of the windows, is a series of dates over the 20th century and the exact sunspot positions, because they're recorded in an observatory every day, the exact positions of the sunspots that took place on that day. And the dates are taken from like significant revolutions over the 20th century. So you have like Tiananmen Square, you have like Vietnam, you have the most recent one in the form of last year's Black Lives Matter. These like large movements of people and just kind of thinking about like how to create a kind of different chronology of human history, I guess, is what I found kind of interesting about that possibility. Which maybe leads nicely onto weird economies, which is what you literally just launched like a month ago or something.
So thanks for the invitation. Thanks, Gary, for being in conversation with me, because I've been fascinated with your work for a while through Anna's introduction. So, I mean, strangely, my introduction to economic thought started from thinking about the art economy, which I think is something that we're going to address later. I was mainly like a video artist before getting into that zone, and I was based in Beirut on a residency, and at some point with a friend of mine, we started to, because we went through like similar like institutional, struggles, like we started to think about, well, there is something that seems to be particular about the art system and the way it's functioning. So is there a way to come up with like a set of protocols or something that's, that regulates the system? And like those things that are particular to the art system, I guess, because most people here are probably familiar with it, but like, not to over-explain, but like overall, there's an informal environment, like everything is very informalized, very much kind of like embedded in these like friendship, nepotistic networks. And that's actually, like, speaking of valuation, like that's basically the mode of valuation of art, like basically that turn to like let's say the institutional turn. What it means is that like something is called art if the members of the art world like call it art. And that makes it like kind of like a particular case, but at the same time, I mean, later on, I would say, like, I think this is also what's like the financialization term kind of like embodies, and that's how they kind of respond to each other. So it's not completely a fiction, but maybe it's a socialized fiction. What the art word signifies as art, basically. So the idea was like, you know, it seems like there's something that's very like, you know, overarching with the art world in terms of like how you're kind of like caught up with this informalized system, which basically what it means is that labor is easily exploited, you know, wages are not clarified, like there are these assumptions around what work is in the art world that you can, you know, easily it's kind of like placed in a gray zone that's like easily exploitable. So we were questioning like whether there's a way of like regulating this system, which is not completely new. There's been like multiple unionizing efforts like throughout the modern art history. But what we are also like diagnosing was that this is also like what sets contemporary art apart is the globalization and the effect of how the transnationalization of the art world now like puts a different condition also on this informalization, which means that maybe local unionizing efforts are not enough anymore. When you have, you know, people like someone from New York that can affect, like, you know, a particular context in Beirut, and you don't have access to those people the same way that you had before through like regulation. I mean, these were the questions that we were asking around that time, and that project kind of like faded out due to like similar conditions that we are diagnosing, like the precarity of like me and my friend who were like working on it, because at some point like you just like burn out and like things are unfinished. So that led to this, basically the research ideas kind of led to more of a historical research around that time that I was started to look into modes of planetary governance. So kind of starting from these questions of formalization of the art economy, then I started to think about, well, like what was the histories of like thinking about planetary regulation, planetary governance. And like one case that kind of stood out was cybernetics in the, you know, socialist states around in the 20th century. And basically the two famous examples, one of them is what was going on in the Soviet Union, and another one was in Chile. So I started to look into the history of cybernetics in the Soviet Union, which kind of like turned into this film in 2018. And well, there's many ways of like introducing that project, but I think, I mean, the project of cybernetics in the Soviet Union. But I think maybe like the kind of like catchiest way is that they were kind of imagining the other internet before the internet came to being in the US. And the way that they were imagining the internet was, you know, this network of interconnected computers that would be in the service of organizing the economy, which is quite different from what the internet dream in the United States was like when it started to emerge. And like to some accounts, actually, these ideas were formulated in the Soviet Union before they started to shape in the US, which also like changes this idea of like, you know, the backwardness, like the scientific backwardness in the Soviet Union. The reasons that these projects didn't actually came to being was like more had to do with how, I mean, there's this like funny quote that like Benjamin Peters, who's like a scholar of this cybernetics history, he says that like people in the Soviet Union were acting more like capitalists, whereas like around that time in the US, like when internet came to being, like there was actually some kind of socialist like imaginary of you know, how different entities collaborated for these like scientific projects that came to being. But actually it was like the informalization of like the like post-Stalin or like, you know, Stalin and post-Stalinist Soviet Union that actually didn't allow these projects to take shape. So I basically, I mean, so how that applies to the current situation is, I mean, there are all these conversations around platforms, you know, like the current platforms, Google, Amazon, they have the capacity to organize like, you know, large-scale economies if they want to go to that direction. So there's kind of a movement on the left that calls for, you know, attention to what are the potentials and possibilities of platforms, basically. But I think this was also around the time that I started my PhD, and well, in the tradition of being constantly like self-critical of past work, I started to question maybe this kind of like fixation with regulation and organization, and of course there's a balance to that, but also there's something like finance, which I think kind of like is countering all those like efficiency discourses in the 20th century, and it kind of like emerges as a different type of paradigm to that kind of like economic efficiency fixation of like the socialist thinkers, basically. So then like kind of like to put it under like a weird umbrella that I haven't like maybe like discussed yet, is like I started to think about like what would be a form of socializing finance, and maybe there is like something to like something to save or like rescue from how finance functions that can be used in the service of any kind of like leftist imaginary. And maybe like I can address that. Should we like address that later? I don't know. Like it gets into.
Yeah, I mean.
Oh, and weird economies, maybe.
Yeah. I guess. Yeah, maybe you can just like introduce the recent kind of platform that you are opening up.
So in the past few years, basically what I was working on was this platform. I mean, I call it a platform. It's a platform because it's a very like contested word. Like people use it in many different ways, and that's kind of actually partly embedded in the definition of platforms. Like they're supposed to be a bit vague because like they kind of like try to like commercialize around this like vagueness of what platforms are, which is basically bringing users and connecting them to like producers or advertisements, like whatever. Like it's kind of like it's supposed to be a connective node, and like the vagueness kind of works to bring things together. So I'm using like platform a bit loosely. It's more like a project at this point called Weird Economies, and basically, the intention is to try to kind of like think around this question of like socializing risk and socializing speculation, and kind of like rescuing the time dimension that's embedded in finance, which I think doesn't belong to the kind of like rigid regulatory economic imagination, to rescue that time dimension and like try to think about how that could be useful to us, like let's say on the left. I just assume that maybe not. We'll see.
I don't know, let's polarize the room and think out why now. Yeah, maybe you can explain I think it's something that we're both kind of interested in, this time dimension of finance. Like I kind of think about it in terms of like engineering times, like temporal kind of engineering or something like that. But like why did you where does time come into it for you?
Okay, so how to address it? I think
or what's interesting about financial time?
Why is it important that to kind of to keep time alive? How to? Okay. Wait, that's a hard question.
I mean, for example, I guess what I was thinking of is like this idea that the price of something, and finance has many kind of quite useful concepts for thinking about how a relatively non-linear kind of time, and like Elena Esposito and people like this write about it a lot, where quite simply the pricing of something in the market is presumed to be the kind of presumed, it's the expectations placed upon this thing about everyone's expectations of this thing in the future brought into the present, right? There's this kind of set of expectations, a set of speculations. Some people think up, some people think down, and they all kind of like coalesce allegedly into this like particular truth of this object at a particular moment. And that's not like the price of something at this moment is not related necessarily to the present. It kind of has to do with like bringing various different futures into to bear on the current moment. That's that's kind of one kind of time loop that seems like quite interesting. And then once you get into the kind of horrible, messy world of like derivatives and into kind of like options and all these like instruments, you get into this like weird inventory of like time engineering tools for like hedging the smallest things. And we spoke a little earlier about Louis Bachelier and Black-Scholes model, which is like this kind of very important moment in modern finance for basically a formula for pricing options. But the idea that came through there was that, with this particular formula, you can have, by hedging mechanisms, you can have like profit at all possible prices. That all states of the market you can make money on, because like if you think the market's going to go down, you hedge this way. You think the market's going to go up, you hedge this way. And then you've got all these different players using particular formalized kind of techniques to basically balance their risks, but also they're always really hungry for more risks, because risk is what makes a market. It's what people make money on. Someone has to lose. And so there's this kind of weird game of like tucking away little pockets of risk while trying to eat more of it. Is how I kind of think about it. And until you kind of, until you allegedly have this idea of like a perfect market, which is like has resolved itself and everyone has all of the information at a given time.
Yeah, I guess actually the market is like a good way to discuss why temporality is important. Because basically, I mean, like you said, like maybe I can give a historical account, because like my work basically, I mean, I started to look into history of economics in the past few years as an artist. So no claim on like, being very good at it, but
I'm cooking this egg as an artist.
Yeah. The perfect excuse to. Yeah.
It's what you can call the de-skilling of the artist. No?
Exactly. Yeah, as a de-skilled artist who looks into economics history, I mean, it's really fascinating, because you start like looking to like the most like you think of this as like this dead, like very boring discourse, but when you actually dig into it, it's like a wonderland. Like it's like Disneyland. Like how uncanny like these ideas are, and how they're like normalized at this point, like what we call neoliberalism. Like, is it even like this current condition? Is it even neoliberalism? Like, according to what the like the origins of like neoliberal like doctrine was voicing back then, or yeah, basically what the market is. Like, no one like discusses the market, and this is something that Philip Mirovsky, this political economist, talks about, that like everyone thinks they're talking about economy or political economy, but no one is actually addressing the market. Like, what is that? Like, how did it come about? And basically, I mean, in the history of like 20th century economics history with neoliberals, there was this kind of like century-long clash around this kind of like big debate called the calculation debate, or the socialist calculation like controversy, which I mean, the kind of like, to simplify it, basically the like Ludwig von Mises, this like Austrian school economist, they're criticizing socialists in the Soviet Union and similar people, that like your project is bound to fail because there is just like so much amount of data that you have to process to to process, to process economy, and like no system at this point can do that. Whereas we have this like fantastic, like ideological machinery, not ideological, but this like non-physical, non-material machinery that's called the market. And the market does that calculation without actually needing to process all this data because it's a decentralized system. And no one needs to have like the control, or no one needs to be like the central kind of like, thinking head of the machine to do that calculation. So basically for the next like 100 years, like that was like the kind of like eternal struggle between socialists and anyone on the market socialists, or like market thinkers or neoliberals, to kind of prove them wrong. And when the computers happened, and this was basically the cybernetics turn, like that was the moment that they're like, okay, now with the computers we can actually do this, we can do the calculation, so none of that is valid. But then again, so this is I think where time comes in, because what's usually overlooked, so all of this debate kind of like falls into the efficiency discourse again. It's like, how can we be more efficient? And like if you can't, like without the computers basically help in the service of the higher efficiency of calculation. But another thing that Hayek was talking about, and like in my view and like others' view, like it's kind of like a bit overlooked, is that actually the market is like addresses not the problem of efficiency, but the problem of knowledge. And that's where I think what he's hinting at is like the figure of speculation that he wasn't like kind of like clarifying back then. But the fact that you can't know things in advance, you can't know what people want like before an act of exchange happens. So there is something actually quite esoteric at this point. And actually later in his life, like these ideas like became even more esoteric, that the market is this like weird like entity that can know about the future without actually knowing, or like no one like in the system knowing what's gonna be desired. And so sorry, like last part, like I talked for a while, but like we are talking about this over lunch too. So there was a point that like these what's it called, like Chicago school neoclassical economists, they try to take Hayek's words like seriously, and that's where finance was born, out of like trying to apply speculation that Hayek was pointing to, and try to calculate this future on the basis of their mathematical models. So the mathematicization of the future was kind of like the marriage of like neoliberalism and neoclassical economics in a way, which was also had like a relationship to socialist thought. So weirdly, this moment, like basically what I'm pointing out to is that it's not completely neoliberal. It's also like there's also an inheritance of socialist rationalization of economics that's that's embodied in like how financial markets work, or like predictive models work. I don't know how much I addressed the time thing, but
Can I just interject the conversation with a question?
Yes.
It's not really a question, but it's more like, well, first of all, thank you for the historical trajectory. It's been very interesting and useful also to look at finance and economy through this longer lens. But something that you just mentioned around, like two words you just mentioned, that I thought might be useful to try and bring back the conversation into the economy that, well, one of various economies that we inhabit, which is the economy of art. And you spoke about efficiency and esoteric or esotericism. And it seems to me that in a way the various economies of art, or the economies that sustain the system, the art system, are somehow a strange combination of an attempt of efficiency, while at the same time being built on this sort of speculative, esoteric, and completely fictional infrastructure. And I know that both of you are quite interested, Bahar, you were mentioning it earlier, in the economy of art, and you're trying to somehow address certain issues, challenge certain elements, but also at the end of the day, this is the economy that you both and we inhabit. So I was just wondering if you could delve a bit more into that and into those reflections, and maybe this is a way also to talk about, especially for you, Bahar, how Weird Economies is challenging or addressing the economy now.
It's your time. Go next.
I mean, I don't really have a very deep position on the art economy more broadly, and partly in the sense that I feel like most of us kind of grew up on, or like formed into art as a field with the understanding that it was simultaneously a space for economic experimentation and like social experimentation, which there was therefore also economic, and was also, you know, pretty much emblematic of some of the worst excesses, and almost like a kind of a miniature version of like the kind of most ridiculous excesses of the global economy, as you know, because just to look at it historically, the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, the kind of the emergence of finance, the kind of emergence of like globalization, gentrification kind of debates that artists are also very implicated in, the emergence of like kind of proper 90s curatorial culture and the kind of jet set class and kind of 90s globalization and art fairs, those things like as a luxury asset of sorts, and as a kind of, we talked about this before, as like something that repeatedly dematerializes into like an economy of, you know, paintings, to economy of like presence, to economy of attention, of like these various kinds of authentic luxury that art is still able to give people who, you know, of a certain class. That's I feel like that's kind of known and considered, and you know, anyone who cares about it should be watching like what's going on, what might happen in China with the contemporary art kind of thing. But on the other hand, and this I think relates to Weird Economies, art has also constantly been this space in which people attempt various forms of either local communal kind of efforts, or like a kind of parasitic kind of economic experimentation in terms of either kind of putting on forms of like organizational or corporate or institutional drag, and like, you know, artists as institutions as artists, or like a kind of artist placement group style, you know, back in the 70s and 80s, of like this idea that the artist was this kind of what was, I can't remember their term for it. It's like the third client or something, but the artist as this kind of parasitic, noisy ethnographer, instigator party. And I think that all of that has been kind of delightfully absorbed into contemporary like corporate consultancy culture. And I guess my feeling about it now is like art exists within this economy as a claim on what used to be a claim on the contemporary, and now is maybe a claim on the future, and a possibility of a set of claims on like what culture is now and what the future is supposed to be. And that's partly why speculation plays such a role in both kind of benign, interesting, and kind of vanilla ways within the art world. It's just like such a kind of happy term to use now, because there's deep uncertainty in all, across all layers of like the kind of social context. But at the same time, when you look at the history of like economic experimentation and kind of ecosystem design in art, you see like a history that I'm really interested in, which is like kind of a history of interesting failure, which is also a history of economic design as well. I mean, like the sunspot stuff and this various attempts, and cybernetics, I guess, as a science in many ways failed, as as a discourse, as a sort of a framing of the world, obviously injected itself into so many other ways of thinking, and was incredibly influential. But in terms of its like founding as this kind of system that I guess I'm talking about systems that seem to be able to be a microcosmic ecosystem for everything, or for the next version of everything. And that's what people saw in computers, what people saw in simulations, that's what they saw in like slime molds more recently, and mycelial networks. And it's yeah, there's a kind of, I feel like a really kind of rich history of repeated failure in that. I think that's a perfectly important space for art to occupy. I'm curious if you think that it can go beyond that.
Yeah, I don't think I have a clear answer on that either.
Fair.
Yeah, but yeah, I think like what you addressed also, this is what we wanted to talk about in relation to the like this space that art and finance occupy around speculation. Like we were talking about this morning, like is it a mirroring effect? Is it like finance kind of projecting the what's happening in the artistic field since like the modern turn, or it's vice versa? Like maybe it's not so much about like the causality, but there's definitely like what I was trying to say in the beginning, that the way that the art system functions in terms of like the mode of valuation, it seems like this is what's like picked up by the financial turn. If like we claim that there's this mode of like fictitious, institutionalized, what the members of the financial world think if something is like valuable, like therefore it does have value. And like whether this is like necessarily a problem. So this is where, this is where it gets like a bit like maybe gets into a murky territory with speculation, because like then you think actually, do we need to like essentialize value? Like should value be essentialized, like not be, not be speculative? So I don't know where I'm going with this, but like something I wanted to address maybe is the role of reputation, maybe as like kind of like, I don't have again very clear thoughts on this, but I think there is something around well, like obviously like the art system, like this mode of working is like functioning by reputation on capital. And like one idea that's emerges with some thinkers these days is activism around reputation and activism around rating. Since you brought up like gentrification too, because basically what happens, like the problem with reputational capital is artists lending reputation to like real estate projects, or that's how like basically speculation functions through like giving good rating to something that's not supposed to have good rating. So like in a way you can think about like all these social movements that's happening these days, like Black Lives Matter, or different kind of like large scale like movements as a way of like countering the flow of reputation and like shifting reputation to other areas that weren't like as reputable or as like credible like before. So I think, I'm trying to think of like, this is something that I was thinking very abstractly how to address with Weird Economies, because also as a platform, platforms have this tendency to centralize reputation and to, basically what they do is like they give reputation to people who participate on it, but eventually, since the nodal point, they kind of like accumulate all the flow of reputation from single people, therefore efflux. So I think there should be a conversation around redistributing the that reputational like tokens that are coming in, and like I don't know how to exactly address it. Some people might say like that's not the most important thing because it's still like in the area of cultural capital. Maybe it's not addressing, the actual capital still, but I think if we take the financial terms seriously, which is, there's like a clear similarity with like how this is happening in the art field. Maybe like what we do in the art field can address that too. So could it become useful to like financialization if we do these experiments in the art world with redistributing credit capital? Or
the redistribution question is interesting because I can't imagine an idea. The idea of redistributing reputation seems provocative and interesting, but I also really can't imagine what that would look like. Within, an economy that's so much based on belief, faith of a sort, and forms of kinship.
Mm-hmm.
And there are kind of the reputation is not only like a bad word for like nepotism or something. There are lots of reputation has a role socially as well. But I kind of was curious to go back to what you said before about something more like socializing. I guess socializing risk and socializing reward. It's like I feel like the more obvious answer to me looks more like pooling resources and something similar to like what artist pension trusts attempted. I don't know how that's going, of like saying that there is this kind of deeply unfair kind of reputational economy where, like, I don't know, someone gets flipped, someone gets picked up, like everyone is working within a particular economy, and suddenly, for no reason, often at the cost of someone's career, they suddenly become incredibly valuable in the market, let's say. Not that any of us really are operating that much in the kind of art fair circuit, but that kind of thing makes me think, it kind of makes sense to have a kind of maybe pseudo anonymity, or like a network in which you could like distribute the reward, but also somehow distribute the risks of operating in this way. Because there are like, there are certain, and not to be in an entirely undramatic way, there are certain kind of risks of operating in this reputational economy, which, because your person and your work and all these things are so very much tied together, I guess. But I don't know, I'm curious what you think about, like, I'm struggling to understand or to imagine what this kind of transformation of like reputation in art would be, because there's such a loss of distinction between the person, the work, the idea,
exactly,
like,
yeah,
intellectual property. we don't.
I mean, I guess I kind of hit a brick wall when I get to that, because like, I mean, that's where like actually it's like a lesson learned to go back to like, does regulation actually work? And that's what the point that you think, like, actually the art system, like, it's inseparable from the star system, or like from the individual, the atomized, like how do you how can we dissociate these two? I actually have a question, because I don't know if I can pass beyond that
brief
point.
Response to that is, I think we're already seeing a fragmentation of like many art worlds, probably. Like the idea that there's a kind of hegemony involving like Eflux and Art Basel, but Eflux probably will stick around. But of that kind of, I think there's an exhaustion probably around certain areas in the market, and there's like very just different bubbles of artistic economies, some of which we may or might not recognize as contemporary art economies, emerging, and I kind of think that kind of proliferation might be a good thing.
How do you see the proliferation, actually? Like maybe some examples.
Yeah, my immediate thought would go to somewhere like gaming, where you have, it's not hugely mainstream to talk about gaming. I'm not hugely involved in it, but there's clearly a great deal of, hundreds, thousands, millions of people are like very involved in various gaming kind of communities and various kind of online communities, and they're very much like, they have their own kind of experimental economies, and which sometimes very much interact with the real economy, and that you're seeing kind of, I feel like, this kind of proliferation of many kind of minor cults, kind of situation, and almost like many religions in a way. And it's other than that, like I think you're probably Bruno Latour recently had that thing about like, whose world are you living in and these different worlds. And yes, we have a world in which like a world of oligarchs and a world of like people in tech who basically don't necessarily live in the same infrastructure as everyone else, because like, or in a world in crypto or something, that's another economy entirely, and people are like, plenty of people are wealthy because of their involvement in that and don't like live in a different economic infrastructure as well. And so I feel like that's probably going to continue. I'm interested
but I
in seeing
guess
how that
that's
spreads.
kind of like the question, would it still function within something? I mean, the question is like, would it still be monetizable as art, or would it be monetizable as something else?
I kind of think all these communities are cultures, and they have some relationship to creating art, but not necessarily in a legible way to like contemporary art world, which feels like a increasingly diminishing and irrelevant kind of culture. Like even I don't know what people who are like designing art school courses are thinking these days, but like I feel like to me that feels like there's a version of that history that, I went through. I can't remember if you actually went through a formal art school kind of education, but there was enough disillusionment and kind of dissonance within even the educational years of that to know that like the game is, it's not like the game is rigged, like hard done by. It's just like the game is not really one that is worth playing in the way that it's presented.
I mean, that's kind of the strange point, because I think that's been going on for a while, but I think like statistically there's still like, a very high rate of like unemployed. I mean, at least in the, in the US and maybe also in Europe, unemployed, like people who would call themselves like professional artists or artists. Like you think that disillusionment should happen at some point, but it doesn't actually.
I guess there's the opposite side of that, which has something to do with how culture is very much funneled and directed in such a way that the artist is kind of one of the ideal characters in the cast of characters that make up society. Like it's supposed to be this kind of, you're supposed to be, special in some way, or like your work is somehow transcending of the misery of everything else, or like I don't know, or that you know something about the future, or whatever. Like this I feel like there's probably, I mean, there are like innumerable MFA programs, and I don't really know where that kind of supply chain is necessarily directed, other than looking at the Chinese context and like this kind of thing. But yeah, I guess many of us are unemployed at different times, or variably employed. Should we also open up to conversation if anyone wants to have any thoughts they want to jump in on?
I've just got a question that I've sort of formulated in my head.
Great.
So apologies if it is a little rough, but upon sort of viewing the works in Bloc Project Cycle 25 and the sort of conversations that we've been having, it's sort of the idea of sort of imagined categorization of time and sort of commodification of the future, the sort of two things sort of ringing in my head. As sort of coexisting within the same space, and the idea of sort of arts and science being places for pure research, but often with the idea of sort of product or a final outcome at the end of it. And I think that that's the sort of space in which sort of capitalist society in which we live sort of gears us towards. And I think that the time in which we've been through this sort of space in which we've been forced to have this idea of, some would say relaxation, some would say sort of a heightened sense of anxiety, has given us an opportunity to reevaluate whether research for research's sake and the value that we attribute to time is actually something that is tradable as a commodity in and of itself. Just whether you actually see that as something to sort of go away and think about.
I think I understand what you mean by time, commodified futures, and this idea of time being tradable. And to my mind, that's kind of pretty much at the heart of like what makes finance, and also what makes finance kind of interesting, maybe to both of us, and different ways of measuring it and kind of de-risking it or foreclosing certain futures in favor of others into investment and this kind of thing. But I couldn't understand if you were saying that research was always being funneled into an output, or if something has caused you to question whether research for research's sake as such was of value, or
I mean, the idea that I am of the mind that research for research's sake, just pure research, is actually more valuable in that you actually get more out of it. It doesn't necessarily have this sort of definitive outcome when you initially set out on the journey. And I think that a lot of the conversations that I have in regards to actually how you come up with the finance in order to come up with the research in the first place is that there has to be an agreed outcome.
Oh, you mean like funding for like scientific projects or something?
That's actually a very good question.
I think that the sort of broader conversation with regards to how research exists seems to have changed as a result of sort of capitalist ideals. And I think that sort of the idea of time and research being allowed to exist just in and of themselves is something that is to be sort of reflected upon.
That's really interesting, because I think I don't actually know what the state of like kind of scientific R&D these days looks like, especially in the UK. But like in a way, that infrastructure was, as far as I'm aware, invented during the Second World War. And someone like Vannevar Bush, who ran MIT, but then became the first founder of the National Science Foundation, pretty much like established this idea of Western national scientific endeavor as like, the state does fundamental research in sciences and like will do fundamental physics and this kind of stuff. And at that time, despite it being essentially a war effort thing, it spawned cybernetics, it spawns early parts of the internet, it spawns like a lot of computing stuff, also it spawned Manhattan. And they were like very open to like blue skies, well, like kind of far-reaching research for research's sake, obviously thinking that at some point something might come of it, but nonetheless, like I feel like I almost idealize, I think a lot of people maybe idealize that period because it seemed so kind of proper research and very innovative and all of this stuff. And now I guess I feel like everything has a much shorter time span and has to be a product much more rapidly and has to become a platform more rapidly, especially in the tech world. So yeah, maybe that kind of temporality has like really kind of truncated and become, because I think it becomes much more short-sighted. Like I have a good example of this, is when I did a project with a collaboration I run called Foreign Objects, which was involved with a commission through Bell Labs in New Jersey, which is like, Alexander Graham Bell. They kind of invented a lot of stuff, including transistors and information theory, and like a pretty foundational. And it was kind of shocking to go to their facility in Murray Hill because it was amazing. It was an incredible place because everyone was like, it was just so far away from the kind of Silicon Valley image of like fast innovation, kind of like productifying kind of, well, they were all like, so much of it was basically just doing basic physics or doing kind of quite kind of experimental stuff. And seemed quite playful. And back in the day, back in the early kind of computing days of the 70s and 80s, which we focused on, they were like extremely playful. And these are through the process that came out with the things like Unix operating system and these kinds of histories. And so I think, yeah, again, there's a kind of, there's a romance I definitely have about different periods of what research looked like and how you got from starting point to a destination, or at least an output, and how you were directed through that. And yeah, I think that there is a version of that is also perhaps true in art. Like you know, the kind of bit where you try and get to the exhibition is kind of probably the hardest bit. But then, like, I know it's harder to have art, to make a defense of art as its fundamental value as research without, you know, its kind of manifestation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking of, like from what you said, I'm thinking of different things, but yeah, definitely, like there's a crisis of research with, like, you know, the defunding of like privatization of universities, and obviously it has an effect on, I think what it's leading to is like the ahistoricity of like this moment. And it actually, it's funny because we talk about the crisis of, you know, the future, or like thinking in future terms, but actually, like, to me, it seems like it's more about like the removal of like past from the conversation. And like, I think how it's manifesting in art, like I've been thinking about it, is like this turn towards like the, you know, design programs and these like, you know, tech design, speculative, like there's really like there's something that should be questioned with these, wherever the word speculation or sci-fi or the future comes in, because that's just like a symptom of, I think that's kind of like resonating with this moment. It's kind of like, you know, and it shows in like, you know, fast solutionism, and, you know, basically with like when the COVID started, like I was like watching a number of these programs, like presentations, like within 2 weeks they had to like come up with like a solution to COVID. It's like, like we don't even know, we don't even know like what it's made of. Like how can we, you know, put artists, like these skilled artists in that position?
You're talking about artists. I was like, no, that's reasonable for them to like have a rapid response in terms of like, you know, medics and like bio researchers for COVID. That's
no.
Artists, yeah.
Artists, designers, coders.
Right.
Can you give some examples of some of what you saw?
Ooh, it's like live stream.
You're talking about
my friends are watching.
You're talking about the New York the residency, the kind of rapid response thing. All right, never mind.
So there's like multiple of them.
Okay. I just thought of something else. I guess relates more to the kind of economic history that, in relation to what you're saying, is also to do with the switch, the kind of massive expansion of shareholder capitalism since the 1970s, in terms of like return on investments, like investments not necessarily in the growth of the company, but in the kind of the projection of the company in the stock market, and that, you know, very materially, you know, how to an extent how Tesla is doing this kind of thing now. It's like it's not about this idea of investment as a long-term investment that allows the company to buy, like, you know, make capital gains and like buy more factories or whatever, do more research. Instead, you had this like huge turn towards, I can't remember the whole situation, but it involves now things like share buyback schemes and things like this, which are basically there to boost CEO earnings and to boost the kind of share performance of the company, rather than giving it actual value to do more research and to grow and do R&D and this kind of stuff. So there's like a sort of, I mean, Mariana Mazzucato is a great economist to read on this particular history. And in terms of the kind of risk-reward stuff, I mean, I think I take a lot from her work in terms of understanding who is taking the risk of a particular narrative of progress. Like, you know, her argument was essentially around like most of the great inventions or the great kind of innovations that we kind of tend to attribute to particular tech innovators or something were also massive investments by the state, which to start those, to make those things possible, whether it's Silicon Valley or like, I can't remember the UK example. But the state has never, or the state representing the taxpayer and the people has never made a claim on collective ownership of those innovations. Like they always end up being spun out into a private company, which is then sold back to people, and now you have like big platform problems and stuff. Which it has to do with like collective risk taking. Like it's not without risk. It involves it involves designing a system, it involves pouring billions of pounds on a national level into things that may not work, for instance. But it also involves saying when those things do work, and they often can, this is something that like is, you can imagine what could happen with something like that with the vaccine, for instance, I mean, in terms of like biotech. Yeah.
Any questions?
Yeah.
Thanks for the talks. It was great, really generous to talk
Thank
to
you.
the work project. You both talked a bit about, in different ways, the idea of models, or modeling. So Gary mentioned catastrophe modeling, and even the notion of the platform in a way, this kind of vagueness, is a kind of a model, I guess, in a sense. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that and how you see, on one hand, the financial models and the predictive and insurance kind of problematic modeling, kind of logics working. Whether you see the kind of art practice models operating as some kind of counter modeling, and if it is a counter modeling, how do you see that kind of resistance?
Yeah. So whole question of like operation or representation like feels like a whole pretty big wormhole. No, it's a great question. I mean, I was kind of curious with you and with Economies, especially, it has the question of counter modeling. Like I realized on reflection that most of my work really is kind of about like got interested in various enterprises in modeling, like whether it's cybernetics, ecosystems, information theory, like catastrophe stuff, and especially with the catastrophe stuff, it was interesting because it comes up against its own limits, because the limit of whether like the boundaries of the atmosphere and the earth, the boundaries of material kind of resources, or like the boundaries of computing power of simulation, like in these ways in which like ways in which these kind of models also then start to determine, like basically, for example, how the mechanisms we use to value climate or value land and ecology through climate insurance and these other financial mechanisms, they are obviously also playing a role in shaping the very grounds of these systems. And like there are fascinating examples of this where recently Ian Gray is a sociologist who wrote a great piece about this when the insurance people, the modelers were like, they're scientists, they're like good civil engineers and scientists, they want to do like good work. And they were like, hey, we can't use the historical record because our current time doesn't follow the averages of history as over the last 150 years. We're going to have to like put some other kind of guesswork, like expert guesswork together and think about how we adjust our model. And they did that, and then it turned out the insurance premiums had to like shoot up like 40% or something. And they went to the states and they went to the kind of governments and said this, and then like the governments are furious, the consumer groups are furious, like everyone's like, you're running a cartel, what are you talking about? The insurers are furious, like run us out of customers. And so there was kind of this, I mean, it's a horrible but kind of beautiful moment where like you can't like the dissonance is held too strongly, and you can't like accept an alternate, possibly more true version of the reality, and you have to like keep kind of chewing down into the system you're in. This is primarily in like Southern American states. Which some of which have banned the use of anything but the entire historical average in their future projections, which is it's kind of wild. But yeah, I mean that's an example of a modeling paradigm I find quite interesting, I guess.
It's a tough question, but I'm also thinking. Like there's this idea that actually one of the people I'm working with in the platform, she directed me to this essay by Timothy Mitchell, which basically the argument is economy is a construct of economics discourse. Like economics actually gave rise to like economy and ex facto, and that happened through modeling and representation, and there was so much of that. Different forms of mapping and representational forms and modeling that came about to like give rise to what we call economy, and it's kind of like taken for granted. And I think I feel like also in a way, like without noticing, maybe a lot of my work has something to do with like scale models also, like thinking of whether like the arts ecosystem, like you're saying with weird economies, could be like a scale model for like, the larger economy, or like whether it's the other way around, because like the art system is actually more expansive than like, what cybernetics Russia was like maybe. And kind of thinking of like, the artist as like that subject, like, proper, that can be like thought about as like, the financial subject. So if we can think about how to like sort out this field, then like maybe these experiments can be applied to like the other scene. But yeah, I mean, it's the first time I'm thinking about modeling in that sense.
I think modeling can also be very important and beautiful. I think like how a system models itself, how it senses its own kind of and projects itself, whether it's like kind of on a human individual level or on a kind of whole kind of social eco kind of level, is like a really fascinating thing. It's like how there's there was economy before political economist and then like mathematical economist or something like that. There was obviously exchange and whatever. There are all these ingredients, all these kind of ingredients that go into this thing, but only at one point, we decided to kind of like think of it as a particular system. And I mean, this is also the early 19th century. Like the Panic of 1825 is thought to be some ways one of the first economic crises proper, because it was the product of a well-functioning set of economic institutions, each doing their own thing, each functioning relatively well, but somehow everyone just went crazy on them, and the whole thing like went a bit into a bubble and popped. And it was like, oh, no one can control this. No one can. At least I think that's like it was not related to like a material external trigger. It was like just this situation that seemed to arise out of all these independent institutions. I mean, I hope there aren't economic historians watching and shaking their heads. Yeah, I don't know.
I actually have a question about like a more practical question, maybe even to do with modeling. I guess when I hear the word modeling, I think of so many different ways that you can model things. You have people maybe CGI kind of graphic modeling and trying to kind of make the shape of something. And I also think back to our conversations in the past where you were trying to think of what the shape of the exhibition would look like, and it came in the form of lists and works. And so I just kind of want to ask, in your work at the moment, what forms of modeling are you using? And is there any way that you can kind of describe to us like the textures, some of the textures that come up in your modeling?
Yeah, it's really interesting. Do you want to start? I need to think about it.
Yeah, like I'm grasping fluid economies and lots of the concepts, but I am failing to kind of picture like the platform.
Yeah,
you know,
yeah,
when
yeah.
I'm thinking, for instance, Tinder as a platform.
Yeah.
Or, you know, there's a look and feel
That's the first
about
one to
it.
think of.
Yeah.
And, yeah, I'm curious as to where that lies for both of you.
So, I mean, we talked about that a lot today. I mean, just trying to grasp like what Weird Economies is doing, because I was telling Gary and Anna, I've been kind of like intentionally resistant to like say what it is, because I feel like that's kind of like like it's kind of like really like, you know, new agey, like artistic, like whatever, but like I feel like the moment you start to like describe it, because I have to be doing this a lot, I kind of lock down the definition, so it goes against like this ethos of like being speculative or like leaving something open for.
I don't think it's new agey at all, though. I think you said something earlier, like naming something is kind of killing it.
Yeah.
And I think I feel like it's a real formal difference. Like there is such a difference between being something and doing something. And I kind of get like uncomfortable with like these kind of weird multi-hyphenate sort of things that artists now put themselves in. You know, I'm a designer and programmer and like educator and teacher and thinker and doer and sleeper and eater and all that. Like it's, yeah, it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't seem to add, at one point it stops losing any information and it doesn't tell me about what this person does at all. And I feel like there's a kind of, especially in like something like Weird Economies where you're kind of navigating between so many spaces that are themselves also relatively unfixed. It seems to make sense I think it's really tricky. I really like the artists who do it well, to kind of be hard to pin down there and not say like, we are a platform for like artistic experimentation and speculative economics for a better future or something. Like,
that's exactly it. I should
sorry,
write
I killed
it down. No, but I think that's a good point. I think it's better, like, thank God it's like it started a month ago, so I can say what it's doing right now instead of like speculating on like what it's supposed to be. But for now, so it's starting from being a very conventional, maybe journal programming space. So it's kind of collecting different types of artistic practices, like, you know, people like Gary's who are working around like economics, finance in interesting ways. So giving a space to them and, you know, a fee, actually being able to like pay people to bring in their research. But also, I mean, it's trying to self-reflectively think about its position as a platform too. Like if it wants to be a platform, it means that it's basically a nodal space that connects these people to, you know, the resources that they would require, or to a community or to other institutions. And so it kind of like is trying to like find itself in like actual locations. For example, like something that we might develop here with one artist around like pension trust funds and working around like senior care. And another artist in Cuba, Nestor Sire, like he's been curating a program on these like hard drives that like a network of hard drives that go like door to door, because internet is really bad. So like people are, you know, using like manual ways of like entertainment. So he's been like curating an art packet on these hard drives for a year. So we are thinking of like a sort of exchange with him. So it's like people who have like very kind of like, you know, contextualized practices. And so it would be like a way of kind of like making it both like situated and like, you know, up in the air. So you can maybe like the up in the airness would help with the speculative kind of keeping that like dynamic alive and like trying to bring people in. So it's, for now, it's kind of like having this shape, but hopefully at some point, like my kind of like dream is to like turn it into some kind of a community or a forum, or, you know, somewhere that like people can actually have like more of an like one-off like exchange. But that has to be imagined into being.
Yeah, I was trying to think of what kinds of thing it could be. Like it could be a church or it could be a brand. Like both in the sense that both those things
you
are
were
like
saying a cult.
a cult. I said a cult, yes. Like things that don't require a kind of like explicit stamp of like this is what I am, and rather are like kind of made up of its adherents and the ways in which
Like,
it
what do I
pops
love?
up in these spaces.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Church and brand. It's like this adherence, you know.
Yeah.
It's a certain, and it ties back to what you were saying earlier about reputation.
Yeah,
Reputation
kind of
adheres to you, and it's not something that.
Yeah, it goes through all the different, trickles down all the different layers of your kind of social existence or like psychological kind of stuff as well, without being professionalized.
Yeah.
Okay, exactly time almost. Thank you so much for
Thank
this.
you.
Thank you for your question.